Hi, I'm Niels and Oever, and I work at the University of Amsterdam at the Media Studies Department with the Data Active project. I research how norms are inscribed, resisted and subverted in transnational communication networks. I see this as a form of data activism when civil society tries to inscribe norms such as human rights in transnational information infrastructures. For my dissertation, I particularly looked at the bodies of the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the Réseau IP Européen, and the Institute for Electric and Electronic Engineers. This led to my dissertation, The Inscription, Resistance and Subversion in the Governance of the Internet Infrastructure. I think it's important that we look at transnational communication networks because they have always been a proxy for power and control. It was the telegraph line that connected the British colonial empire, which allowed them to control all the colonies from London by using this device and sending Morse code. That resulted in the institution of the International Telegraph Union, which is now called the International Telecommunications Union, established in 1865 and now the still oldest functioning international organization. Right now, if we look at the governance of the Internet, this has created a wide range of different bodies that are all involved with the standard setting of the Internet. And unlike previous networks where only governments were involved, the Internet is governed in a multi-stakeholder manner, meaning that industry, but also government, civil society, academia can participate in these processes, and that these processes are relatively transparent and archive their work really well, giving a lot of opportunity for researchers like myself to understand what is exactly the democratic nature of these negotiations that leads to the infrastructure that is setting the invisible rules for our everyday lives. And that's this funny thing about infrastructure, that it tends to hide itself. But especially when it hides itself, it determines what happens on top, which means in the case of the Internet, our whole society, our relationship with our governments, our relations to our friends, potential loved ones, and even the mediation of ourselves through our own memories and communications. So I studied the transnational governance of the Internet, and I do this in Internet governance bodies. Of course, the governance of the Internet happens in a lot of reflexive practices that also happen outside of Internet governance bodies, but in the end, all consequential practices end up being discussed in such governance bodies. And that's why I think it's very important to study these bodies as a kind of point of interest, as a choke point, as a point of convergence. I do this by looking at the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and the Réseau IP Européen. The Internet Engineering Task Force sets the protocols for the Internet. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers decides how the domain name system is managed, which translates IP addresses to names. So every time you look up a website such as example.com, it gets translated via the domain name system into an IP address so you can visit the website you're looking for. And then finally RIPE, which is one of the 5 regional internet registries which hands out these IP addresses to users and networks all over Europe, former Soviet Union and the Middle East. All these organizations offer different institutional configurations that determine the outcomes of these decisions and therefore what the Internet looks like. So I studied how these configurations, actors and interests shaped the Internet. And I did so by using very different ways. So if you look at these bodies that are mainly dominated by industries, you might not expect texts like "we reject kings, presidents and voting, we believe in rough consensus and running code" to be the unofficial mission statement, because that would sound more like an anarcho-syndicalist action group. And that also resounds a bit of the ideology that people think is residing in the Internet infrastructure. But this might not be the case because, as one can see also in the t-shirts, in which are also significant emblems of communication, that political and financial considerations are an inherent part of the internet infrastructure. I researched the norms and their inscription, resistance and subversion through a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. It is so interesting to look at internet governance because since its early inception, all the meetings and the discussions have been publicly archived, which allowed me to develop software to analyze these mailing list discussions as well as the standards and policy documents that are being published. So in the first chapter of my thesis, I've looked at the evolution of norms and the participation of civil society in such norm setting in the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. In the second chapter, I looked at how these norms get encoded in the internet infrastructure, and in this case, a human rights commitment added to the bylaws of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Then in chapter 3, I looked at how actual professed architectural norms in the Internet Engineering Task Force are actually structurally being subverted and only serve to legitimize the transnational private internet governance regime. And finally, to find more support for my overarching conclusions, I engaged in an experiment to see how norms were actually resisted when they would go against the transnational infrastructural norm of interconnection. And this allowed me to conclude that when norms are introduced or maintained in the internet infrastructure through the following methods. Namely, if the norms are translated to the social worlds of all significantly represented stakeholder groups, and if the norm supports the increase of interconnection between transnational corporations. If this is not the case, the introduced norm will be rejected or the existing norm will be subverted. If a norm is subverted, it can still be professed, however, to legitimize the overarching internet governance regime. And in my experiment, I showed how the introduction of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were actually structurally resisted, even though these networks were often subject to the European GDPR regulation or had signed up to the UNGPs, but on the infrastructural level, these were structurally resisted and subverted. Arguably, this might be leading, even ironically, to the undermining of the private internet governance regime, because we are seeing an increase in unilateral and multilateral law and policy making by governments because the internet does not adapt social and international norms. So whereas that is a topic for future research, especially with the reconfiguration that 5G networks bring with it, and with that we might be returning to the past where telecommunications networks were developed and the internet tried to overcome that, but then in reverse. So I hope very much that this gave a bit of an insight in my work. You can find my work at nielstenuver.net and of course at dataactivism.net. Thanks so much. Have a great day.